Let's look at some of the common risks involved in international sales transactions. Starting with what we call distance and logistics risk. Now, the case in your book is called Transatlantic Financing Corp versus United States, Supreme Court case from 1966. This involved the sale of wheat from the United States to Iran. And the United States contracted with Transatlantic Financing Corp to ship the wheat from the United States to Iran. The wheat is loaded onto a cargo vessel. It is en route to Iran. The route for the trip is going to involve the use of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is the canal that connects the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. It is a major route used by international shippers because otherwise, in order to get goods from the West, to get goods from the United States or Europe to the East, you would have to go all the way around Africa. And so it is quite common to use the Suez Canal, which is in Egypt. Now, so in this case, we have the wheat is on its way and is going to be taken through the Suez Canal. A war breaks out in Egypt. The canal had originally been financed by the British and the French, and Egypt nationalized the canal, which is to say this canal no longer belongs to you, private companies from England and France, but instead belongs to the people of Egypt. Britain and France don't like this idea, and so a war breaks out over the Suez Canal. Now, the president of Egypt at the time realizes that he cannot go to war with England and France simultaneously. And so what he does is decide to blockade the Suez Canal. And so he sinks a number of ships in the canal that make it impossible for transit. The British and the French companies realize now that they've lost the subject matter of the dispute. They no longer have access to the canal because Egypt has put in these barriers to it. And so the war ends. But the problem is, for a shipment of goods like this one, the goods that were headed toward the Suez Canal must now be redirected around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa to eventually reach their destination. So a lot longer time period is going to pass. And that involves what? Costs, additional cost. So Transatlantic Financing Corp sues the United States saying, we want the extra money that it will cost because of the factors that we had no control over, which was the closure of the Suez Canal. The United States says, well, wait a minute. This is something that you could have anticipated, and you could have put it in the contract. You could have set out two figures. Here is the amount if we transit using the Suez Canal. Here would be the amount if we have to go around the Cape of Good Hope. And the United States argues that just because you failed to consider this in your contract, we're not liable for the extra money. We agreed to pay X amount of dollars for transit of the goods. We didn't put any specifications on how the goods were going to be transmitted. So what this means is that because of this longer distance, these are risks that the parties ideally should have anticipated in their contract. Foreign exchange risk is also a risk, meaning as foreign currency rises and lowers against a currency, then it may be worth more or it may be worth less. A dollar today may equal 1.1 euro, or 1 euro may equal $1.1, and that number can fluctuate. And so if we have an international contract that is denominated in a currency, then we may be subject to that currency becoming more valuable or less valuable. So any appreciation or depreciation of the domestic or foreign currency will impact the cash flow of international transactions. Political risk. When a country's government unexpectedly alters its policies, it can give rise to a political risk. So a country's national government may implement changes in its foreign trade policy and erect trade barriers that can adversely impact trade with overseas companies. When Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, he came in, one of his largest priorities was reducing the nation's trade deficit with China. And how do you do that? Well, he put in increased tariffs, higher tariffs, meaning a tariff is a tax placed on goods simply because it crosses a border. And so these taxes are going to be paid by the buyer. They are not paid by the seller. So the American company that is contracted with China is going to be paying this tax, and they're either going to have to absorb that extra money that they're spending, or they have to pass it along to their customers. All of which could affect the trade. And this is a factor that is completely outside of the control of the individual businesses involved. So the government may come in and impose tariffs or put in a quota on imported items, often designed to protect domestic producers from competition. This can be problematic for companies engaged in long-term deals. So, for instance, when we placed a tariff on steel brought in from Canada, oftentimes these contracts occur over the course of years. And the goods now become much more expensive, not because it's more expensive to produce, but simply because it's now going to cross a border. So there's a political risk involved in any international sales transaction. Regulatory risk, obviously there are governing bodies that set out regulations, and companies often have to adhere to those regulations while conducting business with foreign firms. And those changes that are imposed by a country's government or regulator body can diminish the prospects or the value of foreign investments. They can increase your cost, they could alter the competitive landscape, or ruin your business model. So regulatory risk. Intellectual property risk. IP risk. Generally, this involves third parties illegally using or stealing your intellectual property. And so companies that are engaged in cross-border transactions have to be concerned that their intellectual property, their thing of value, their patent or their copyright or their brand identity, all could be subject to appropriation by another company, by another living in another country. So it can be difficult to enforce your intellectual property rights in the third country or a different country than in your own. Every country has its own intellectual property scheme, and one country may not be as protective of it as another company. General commercial risk, involves a lot of different things, but it essentially could be choosing the wrong business partners or choosing the wrong business strategy, problems with interpreting business agreements because of language differences or cultural differences. And of course, one of the major commercial risks in international business is that a company may lack knowledge of the overseas market, which can create poor pricing structures, incorrect promotional strategies, inappropriate times for market entry and exit, and product features that don't align with the buyer's market preference. There's a very famous case from back in the 1960s involving Chevrolet. And when Chevrolet was attempting to sell its new vehicle, which in the United States was called the Nova, the Chevy Nova, and they experienced problems when they tried to sell that product in Latin American countries. Well, why is that? Because in Latin America, in Spanish, no va means it doesn't go. And so it was a very odd name to use for an automobile. And famously, Chevy had to go back and rename the car because it had this name that meant something different in Spanish-speaking countries as in the English-speaking countries. Cross-cultural risk, differences in customs, norms, language, lifestyles, etiquette, customer preferences. And then, of course, language plays a role in that too, another layer of complexity. There's a lot of debate about whether language determines our behavior. Does the fact that we think in a language cause us to act in one way or another? Could be. Language risk can be a problem in terms of understanding the language. The case in your book called Gaskin versus Stummhandel involved an employee of a German firm who signed a contract written in German that included a forum selection clause, meaning he was required to litigate matters arising out of the contract in Germany. He got into a dispute with his employer about whether he had received the proper amount of commissions. He filed a lawsuit in the United States where he lived. The German company says, wait, you agreed to have that case heard in Germany. Plaintiff says, I didn't speak German. I didn't even know what that meant. Court said, you should have found that out. There's an obligation on you to go and have that contract translated. You cannot rely simply on the other company that tells you what the contract means. You have an obligation to go have it translated for your purposes. International trade controls risk. Sometimes governments have export control and sanctions regimes. We've seen a lot of this in recent years arising out of the military operation between Russia and Ukraine. The United States has imposed sanctions. Well, what sanctions mean is they're really sanctions on doing business, and it prevents Russian companies from buying products from United States companies. And so the sanction can affect you and your business model if you are no longer able to sell goods to Russia because of the sanctions that were in place. So in conclusion, what did we learn in this lecture? In a sales transaction, the buyer and seller each have expectations, each face risks. In a domestic sale, those risks are more manageable. In an international sale, the risks are magnified. Thanks a lot. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next one.